In a small, sun-drenched village nestled at the foot of towering hills, there lived a young girl named Amina. Her beauty was the stuff of legend. It was said that the light of the sun could not compare to the warmth of her skin, and the stars themselves would dim in her presence. Her eyes were like two sparkling rivers, reflecting the depth of the sky, and her smile. It had the power to make even the hardest hearts melt. It was no surprise that suitors came from near and far, hoping to win her heart. But Amina, much to the dismay of many, rejected them all. Amina's mother, a woman with a sharp tongue and a heart filled with pride, stood beside her in every rejection. "What can a poor farmer like you offer my daughter?" she would sneer, her voice dripping with disdain. "You have no riches, no land, no future to offer her. Amina deserves more than the likes of you." And Amina, with her beauty and arrogance, would not disagree. "You are no match for me," she would say, her words like daggers, leaving the men wounded and humiliated. But Amina and her mother were not foolish. They were waiting for a prince, a man with wealth, power, and influence. "A king's daughter must marry a king," Amina's mother would say. "We will wait for the right man, a man who is worthy of our beauty." Days turned into months, and months into years. Amina blossomed into womanhood, her beauty shining brighter with each passing day. The village began to whisper. "Amina is too beautiful to settle for just any man," they said. But time, like the relentless river that flowed through their village, kept moving. And as the seasons changed, the other girls in the village began to marry. They built homes, had children, and became mothers. Yet Amina remained unmoved, her heart still waiting for the prince who would sweep her off her feet. In the village, there was an old saying, "A bird in the hand is better than 100 in the sky." But Amina's heart was set on the sky, where the birds were far too grand to be caught by a mere hand. She would wait for the prince, and no one could convince her otherwise. But as the years went by, the suitors began to change. No longer did handsome young men come to her door, their hearts filled with hope. Instead, the older men well past their prime, came, seeking second wives or looking for someone to care for them in their twilight years. They were men with silver hair, hunched backs, and aching bones. The once vibrant Amina found herself facing men who had already lived their lives. "A man with no teeth has no business asking for a woman's love," Amina would say, turning away these men with a dismissive wave. Her mother, too, became disheartened. "I don't know what is wrong with this girl," she would mutter, shaking her head. "We waited for a prince, and now all we have is the dust of men who are too old to walk straight." But Amina, proud and defiant, stood firm in her belief that no man was worthy of her except the prince she had dreamed of since childhood. She could not accept that she might have to settle for someone less than perfect. "A goat will never make a good cow," she would say, dismissing every suitor who came to her door. And so, as the years passed, Amina's beauty began to fade. The light in her eyes dimmed slightly, though she was still a sight to behold. But age, like a slow-moving storm, began to settle in. The villagers, once enamored with her beauty, now watched in silence, their eyes filled with pity. As she turned 30, Amina stood alone in a village full of married women and children. "What has become of me?" she asked herself, her heart heavy with doubt. But still, she held on to the hope that her prince would come, that he would see her for the treasure she was. Then, one day, her father, who had always been silent about her choices, spoke up. "Amina," he said, his voice filled with frustration, "you must understand that no prince will come unless you lower your pride. There are men who love you, but you push them away." Amina looked at him, her face cold. "A man who loves me should come with more than just words. He must have wealth, power, he must be worthy." Her father sighed deeply. "And you, my daughter, may end up with nothing at all." But Amina would not hear it. The dream of the prince kept her going. And so, she continued to wait. As her 30th birthday came and went, Amina sat by the window, gazing at the setting sun. The sky was painted with shades of orange and purple, but Amina's heart was clouded with doubt. "Am I making a mistake?" she wondered. But her pride would not let her admit it. Then came another knock on the door. This time, it was an older man, his back bent with age, but his eyes still full of life. "I have heard of your beauty, Amina," he said, his voice soft yet confident. "I may not be a prince, but I am a man of honor and wealth. Will you marry me? Amina looked at him, her eyes filled with disgust. You are too old for me, she said, her voice cold. I would rather remain alone than marry you. The man, disheartened, left her home, and Amina returned to her place by the window. The sun had long set, and she was once again alone. The village had moved on, but Amina was still waiting for a prince who had never come. Amina sat by the window, gazing out into the twilight. The world outside seemed to move on, while she remained suspended in the past, her beauty frozen in time, just as her dreams of the perfect match lingered. The river that forgets its source will soon run dry, she thought bitterly. Her once bright eyes, now clouded with years of waiting, reflected a sadness she could no longer hide. As the years passed, Amina's beauty became the subject of whispered conversations among the villagers. She is the fairest of them all, they would say. But what good is beauty when it cannot bring love? The once hopeful suitors now became fewer, and the few who dared to visit were not the men Amina had imagined. Instead, the men who came were those with weathered faces, men whose youth had long since faded, seeking not love but companionship for their final years. Amina's pride, however, remained unbroken. The tortoise is never concerned with the frog's opinion, she would say, dismissing the men who came with their grey hairs and hunched backs. Her mother, too, scorned these men, shaking her head in disgust as she saw the suitors dwindling to those seeking second wives or simply needing someone to nurse their aging bodies. I would rather see my daughter remain unmarried than to see her settle for any of these old men, she would shout, though her voice had lost the sharpness of her youth. But Amina's heart, though still beautiful, began to change. The lioness who loses her pride will soon become the hunted, she thought, watching the other women in the village grow older, while their lives flourished with children, husbands, and homes filled with laughter. A deep ache grew in her chest as she realized that her beauty, once her greatest asset, was now becoming her greatest curse. On her 33rd birthday, as the village gathered to celebrate the harvest, Amina wandered alone by the river, her thoughts tangled in regret. She had watched her friends grow into mothers, with children running at their heels, their homes filled with joy. She, on the other hand, stood by the river's edge, her face etched with the lines of time, wondering what she had done wrong. Her father, now older and more weary than ever, found her standing there, staring into the water as if it could offer her the answers she so desperately sought. He approached her slowly, his steps heavy with the weight of years. Amina, he said softly, your mother and I warned you. You cannot wait forever for a perfect man to come. Beauty alone will not bring you happiness. Amina turned to face him, the frustration evident in her eyes. I would rather be alone than to marry beneath me, she snapped, though her voice lacked the conviction it once had. The harshness of her words hung in the air, but her father only shook his head, a sad smile playing at the corners of his lips. Your mother and I, we built our lives on love, not wealth or beauty. We made our way together, hand in hand, and now look at us, growing old without seeing our dreams fulfilled. Don't let your beauty be the thing that blinds you to what really matters. Amina looked away, unable to bear the sadness in her father's eyes. The child who ignores the advice of the elders will soon find himself lost in the forest, she thought to herself, but her pride still held firm. As the years passed, Amina found herself increasingly isolated. The village began to notice the absence of suitors at her door. The sound of laughter, once associated with the days when young men would come to her home, faded into silence. The stars may shine bright in the sky, but they, too, grow cold over time, she realized with a start, the truth of her situation becoming clearer than ever. One evening, after another failed visit from a man who could offer her nothing but his old age and weak hands, Amina stood at the window of her home, her once radiant beauty now just a faint echo of what it had been. She thought of all the years she had spent waiting. Why did I wait? She wondered, tears silently streaming down her face. Her beauty had been the prize she had kept locked away, and now it seemed that no one cared for it. But just as she was about to give in to her despair, there was a knock on the door. Amina's heart skipped a beat, and she straightened herself, wiping away the remnants of her tears. She had heard this sound before, but this time, it was different. This time, she had no expectation of grandeur. She opened the door to find a man, older than most, but still with a certain strength in his eyes. I heard about you, Amina, he said with a gentle voice, bowing low. I may not be young, but I offer you what I have, my heart, my respect, and my love. The man's words hung in the air, but they weren't the words she had hoped for. They weren't the promises of riches or power, only the quiet offer of something far more fleeting, love without condition. For a moment, Amina felt the sting of realization. A broken pot may still serve as a bow, but it is no longer fit for the feast, she thought, her heart sinking. She had rejected all those who could offer her love, and now, she was left with this. The man, patient and understanding, gave her a final bow and left. But Amina stood in the doorway for a long while, unable to move, unable to speak. The night grew colder, and the wind whispered through the trees. The woman who waits for the sun may never see the dawn, Amina whispered to herself, the weight of her choices pressing down on her. Time, as it often does, kept moving. Amina's beauty, once radiant and captivating, now seemed like a distant memory, an echo of the girl she had been. The days of her youth were now far behind her, and with each passing year, the gap between her dreams and reality grew wider. The once bold dreams of marrying a prince had transformed into a quiet, painful acceptance of the men who came knocking at her door, men with silver in their hair and age in their bones. At 40, Amina's face no longer held the same youthfulness it once did. Fine lines had begun to creep around her eyes, her smile no longer as effortless. Her once vibrant skin now looked worn by the weight of time. Yet, when she walked through the village, she still turned heads, though now, it was more out of pity than admiration. The men who saw her now were not the young, handsome suitors who had once fought for her attention. These men were older, some even in their 60s, seeking second wives or someone to care for them in their waning years. Amina could no longer deny the truth that had been knocking at her door for years. The world had moved on, and so had the village. The young men who had once vied for her hand were now married with children, their lives full of love and laughter. The other village girls, the ones she had looked down on in her youth, were now wives and mothers, tending to their homes, their lives full of purpose. And Amina? She was alone, still waiting for the prince she had dreamed of as a young girl. Her mother, now a frail woman with a body bent by age, had grown quiet over the years. The sharp words that once flew from her lips like daggers now came in hushed tones, laced with bitterness. "You are just like me," her mother would say, her voice barely a whisper. "We both thought our beauty would save us, but now look at us. No husband, no children. Just emptiness." But Amina refused to accept it. The tiger may lose its teeth, but its roar is still feared, she thought, clinging to the belief that her beauty had been her worth. Yet, even she couldn't ignore the growing emptiness in her heart. One evening, as Amina sat outside her home, the sun setting in the distance, she thought about all the men she had rejected. Each one, she believed, was not worthy of her. She had rejected them for their age, for their lack of wealth, for their perceived imperfections. She thought back to her father's warnings, "A woman who waits for the perfect man may never find a husband." She had dismissed him then, but now, as the years piled on, those words echoed in her mind like a distant drumbeat. She had waited, and now, she was left with no one. That evening, as the stars began to appear in the sky, another knock came at her door. She stood slowly, her body stiff from years of waiting, and opened it without a word. Standing before her was an older man, his face weathered by time, but his eyes still sparkled with a youthful energy. "I know I'm not the man you once dreamed of," he began, his voice deep and steady. "But I have heard of your beauty, and I wish to offer you a chance at love. I have a house, a farm, and I can provide for you. I offer you my heart, though it may not be as young as it once was." Amina's heart twisted painfully. She looked at the man, and for the first time in many years, her pride faltered. His offer was not the grand, royal proposition she had imagined. He was a man with no grandeur, no wealth beyond his small farm. His hair was graying, his skin lined with the marks of age. But there was something in his eyes, something kind, something real, that made her wonder, if only for a moment, whether her years of waiting had been in vain. But pride still clung to her, like a shadow that refused to let go. "I would rather live alone than marry an old man," she thought, the words bitter on her tongue. "I'm sorry," she said, her voice colder than she intended. "You are too old for me. I cannot marry you." The man nodded, disappointment flickering in his eyes, but he said nothing further. He simply turned and walked away, disappearing into the night. Amina stood in the doorway for a long time, staring at the empty space where he had been, her heart heavy with regret. What have I become? She thought, as the weight of the years pressed down on her. She had rejected the only man who had come to her with love, not because he was unworthy, but because she still believed she deserved better. But now, no one else was coming. The suitors had stopped knocking, and the loneliness that had once seemed so distant now felt like a permanent companion. Days turned into weeks, and Amina's heart grew heavier with each passing moment. The villagers, once so full of gossip about her beauty, now looked at her with pity, their whispers louder than before. She was too proud to marry, and now she has no one, they would say, though Amina could hear the judgment in their voices. Her father, who had been quiet for so long, spoke again. Amina, it is not too late. I know you have waited for a perfect man, but he may never come. It is time to accept that love comes in many forms. But Amina, her pride shattered, could no longer deny the truth. The snake that keeps its tail hidden will eventually be caught in its own trap, she thought, her heart breaking with the realization that she had let her pride trap her in a life of solitude. The village, once filled with the sounds of young love, had grown quiet. The other women, who had once been her rivals, now had families of their own. Their homes were full of children's laughter, while Amina's house stood silent, her heart aching with loneliness. She began to wonder if her beauty had ever truly been a gift, or if it had only been a curse. The beauty of a flower fades, but the thorns remain, she thought, staring at her reflection in the mirror, seeing the lines of age creeping into her face. But it was too late. The man who had offered her love was gone, and the door was closed to Amina. She had waited too long for a prince, and now, the reality of her choices settled in like a heavy weight. And so, the years continued to slip by, each one a painful reminder of the dreams she had let slip through her fingers. A woman who waits for the sun may never see the dawn, she thought, as the world continued to move forward, leaving her behind. Amina sat alone in her small home, her gaze fixed on the flickering flame of the oil lamp. The shadows danced on the walls, as though mocking her. In the silence of the evening, she could almost hear the whispers of the village, the murmur of their judgment. There she is, the beautiful woman who waited too long. She had once been the pride of the village, admired by everyone, the girl whose beauty was as legendary as the moonlit river. But now she was the one people spoke of in hushed tones, the woman whose once perfect life had slipped away, lost in the sand of time. Her parents, once full of hopes and dreams for her, were now both long gone, leaving her to face the consequences of her choices alone. It was her father's death that had truly marked the beginning of her downfall. When he passed, there was no one left to defend her pride. He had always been a quiet man, but he had urged her to choose wisely, to find happiness with a man who would care for her heart. But she had rejected him, just as she had rejected every suitor who came to her door. And now, in the silence of her home, she realized just how deeply she had failed. A man is not his wealth, nor his age, but the love he offers, she thought bitterly. She had rejected the love that had come her way, turning her nose up at it, thinking herself too good, too beautiful, too deserving of something greater. Her mother, who had once stood proudly by her side in every rejection, had grown frail, her voice no longer sharp but filled with regret. Amina, she would say, her voice weak, you have let your pride steal your happiness. No man will come now. You waited too long. There was no anger in her mother's words now, only sorrow, a quiet sorrow that gnawed at Amina's heart. Her beauty was no longer enough to win her the admiration of men. The men who came to her now were not the princes she had hoped for, but older men, seeking second wives or those who needed care in their old age. There had been a time when Amina would have turned away from them without a second thought, but now, with the weight of time pressing down on her, she felt the sting of regret. One evening, as she sat by the window, watching the last rays of the sun dip behind the hills, she saw a figure in the distance, a man walking towards her home. Her heart quickened. Could it be another suitor? A man with wealth, power, or perhaps something more? She quickly stood and made her way to the door, but when she opened it, she found not a young man, but an old man, his face lined with age, his steps slow and deliberate. His eyes, though tired, still carried the strength of a man who had lived a full life. "I have heard of your beauty, Amina," he said, his voice raspy but full of sincerity. "I may not be young, but I am a man of wealth, and I offer you my hand in marriage." Amina's heart sank. The man before her was no prince, no noble suitor. He was a man in his late 60s, his hair a silver crown, his face full of wrinkles and life stories. He was kind, but he was not the man she had dreamed of. "The crow may be wise, but it is no eagle," she thought, immediately dismissing him. She had been so focused on the idea of a perfect match that she had never considered that love could come in different forms. "You are too old for me," she said, her voice cold, but not as sure as it once had been. "I cannot marry you." The old man bowed his head in resignation, but he did not leave immediately. He lingered for a moment, as though waiting for her to change her mind. "I offer you my heart, Amina. I may not be a young man, but I can offer you a life of comfort, of love. What more could you ask for?" But Amina, her pride still holding firm, shook her head. "I would rather be alone than marry you," she whispered, her heart breaking with the decision, but she knew there was no turning back. The man turned and walked away, his shoulders slumped. Amina watched him leave, the weight of her decision pressing on her chest. As she closed the door, the silence of her home seemed to swallow her whole. She sank to the floor, her hands trembling, and for the first time in many years, tears welled up in her eyes. She had spent so many years rejecting suitors, convinced that she deserved better, that her beauty alone would attract the perfect match. But now, as she sat alone in the quiet of her home, she realized that she had spent all these years chasing a dream that was never meant to be. A woman who waits for a man to come from the sky may find herself waiting for eternity, she thought, her heart heavy with the weight of her choices. The days that followed were filled with regret. Amina's pride had robbed her of the chance at love, and now, the village that once admired her had moved on. The women who had married and had children looked at her with pity. She was too beautiful for her own good, they would say behind her back. And Amina could no longer deny the truth of it. One evening, as she walked through the village, she saw a group of children playing in the dirt, laughing and shouting with joy. They were the children of the women she had once considered rivals, the women she had looked down on for marrying young. Now, those same women were happily married with families, their lives full of purpose and love. And Amina? She had nothing but the fading beauty of her youth, a beauty that had no longer been enough to win her the life she had once dreamed of. The tree that stands too proud may one day be uprooted by the storm, Amina thought, as the tears came again. She had spent her life rejecting love, convinced that it would come only in the form she had imagined. But love, she realized now, was not about perfection. It was about accepting the imperfect, the real, and the genuine. And so, Amina sat in the silence of her home, her heart full of sorrow and regret. The years had passed, and the dreams of youth had turned to dust. She had waited for a prince, but all she had now were the memories of those she had rejected, and a deep, aching loneliness that would remain with her forever. But as the days turned to weeks, and the weeks into months, Amina came to a painful realization. The sun may set on the beautiful day, but the night must come, she thought, accepting that her time had passed. She had rejected love for too long, and now, the door was closed. No more suitors would come, no more dreams would be fulfilled. She had lost her chance, and all that remained was the weight of time, pressing down on her heart. The air was thick with silence, broken only by the occasional creak of the old wood in Amina's home. Time had taken its toll, and now, at 50 years old, she found herself sitting in the same room where she had once dreamed of a future filled with love, power, and grandeur. The walls that had once seemed to echo with possibilities now felt cold and unwelcoming. The light from the outside world no longer reached her heart, only the shadows remained. The mirror in front of her reflected a face she scarcely recognized. The beauty she had once flaunted so proudly had faded like the last remnants of a sunset. Her once vibrant eyes, which had glistened like twin pools of water, now held the weight of a lifetime of regrets. Her skin, once smooth and radiant, was now marked by time, the years of waiting and rejection etched into every line on her face. Amina sighed and looked out of the window. The village, which had once been full of suitors and admirers, now seemed distant, as if it belonged to a past life. The other women, the ones she had once looked down on for marrying early, had built families of their own. They now walked through the village with children at their sides, their homes filled with the noise of laughter and joy. And Amina? She was alone, with nothing but the memories of her past decisions and the haunting whispers of the villagers who had once admired her. The woman who waits for the right man may find that he has already passed her by, Amina thought bitterly, recalling the words her father had spoken to her so many years ago. He had warned her, just as her mother had, that beauty alone would not secure her happiness. But Amina had been too proud to listen. She had waited for the perfect man, convinced that only the best would do. But now, in the quiet of her home, she realized the bitter truth. The perfect man had never come, and time had slipped away like sand through her fingers. The death of her parents had been the final blow. Her father had passed quietly, and her mother, once the proud woman who had rejected suitors with Amina, had fallen into a quiet sorrow in her final years. Amina, too, had changed. The stubborn pride that had once fueled her every decision had given way to the quiet acceptance of her fate. She had learned, too late, that the heart that refuses to bend will one day break. But break it did, and now, there was no way to mend it. With the death of her parents, the last remnants of her former life had disappeared. No longer could she rely on their strength or their guidance. The house that had once been filled with their voices now stood empty, a tomb of memories. And as she stood by the window, looking out over the village she had once ruled, she realized that she had become a part of the very gossip she had once scorned. The young girls who had once looked up to her now whispered behind her back, she was too proud, and now look at her, alone and with no one to care for her. The words stung, but they were true. Amina's heart, once full of dreams and hopes for the future, was now filled with regret. A tree that does not bend with the wind will eventually be uprooted, she thought, remembering the words her father had often said. She had been like that tree, too proud, too stubborn, and too set in her ways. And now, like the tree that had been left to rot, she found herself alone, her branches brittle and her roots shallow. But even in the depths of her sorrow, Amina knew one thing. It is better to have loved and lost than to have never loved at all. She had never known love in its truest form. She had always believed that love would come to her, that it would be grand and perfect. But now, as she sat in the quiet of her home, she understood that love, real love, was not about perfection. It was not about beauty or wealth. It was about connection, about accepting the imperfections of life and finding joy in them. Amina's thoughts turned to the man who had come to her door years ago, the one she had rejected so harshly. He had offered her his love, his heart, his life. And she had turned him away. The heart that refuses to accept love will find itself hollow, she thought, remembering his kind eyes and gentle words. She had been too proud to accept him, too sure of herself to see what he had offered. And now, here she was, alone. The world had moved on, and she had missed her chance. She had spent her youth chasing a dream that had never existed, and now, she was paying the price. The sun that sets never rises again, she thought, her heart heavy with the weight of the years. Her mind wandered back to the days when she had been so beautiful, when the world had seemed to revolve around her. But now, that beauty had faded, and so had her youth. What remained was the bitter taste of regret and the harsh reality of her choices. She had been too proud, too stubborn, and now she was paying the price. The final realization came to her slowly, like the fading of a storm. Beauty fades, but wisdom remains, she thought, her voice barely a whisper. The wisdom she had gained through the years of waiting, rejecting, and longing was the only thing that remained. And it was a bitter wisdom, one that came too late to change anything. With a deep sigh, Amina stood up from her chair and walked to the window once more. The village, with its children and families, seemed so far away. She could almost hear the laughter of the other women, their voices filled with joy and love. But for Amina, that world was no longer hers. It had passed her by, and now she was left to face the consequences of her choices. A woman who waits for the wind to change may find herself waiting forever, she thought, her heart heavy with regret. But as she stood there, looking out over the village, she knew that there was no use in looking back. Her life had unfolded as it had, and she could not change it now. All she could do was accept the truth, however painful it was. And so, Amina learned the hardest lesson of all, the lesson of humility, the lesson of love. It was a lesson that had come too late, but it was the only one she had. The beautiful flower may wither, but the roots of wisdom remain, she whispered, the words a bittersweet comfort to her soul. I have learned my lesson, she thought, as the last rays of the sun dipped below the horizon. The beautiful woman who had once rejected love now understood its value. But it was a lesson that would remain locked in her heart forever, a lesson that came only after the world had passed her by.